I cleaned up your room, Lara. It was a mess. Emerging from my room with a smug grin on her face was Sherry, my son's wife. Oh, thank you. I had just cleaned my room a few days ago, but maybe it still looked messy to someone else. I decided to just thank her for now. Sherry, my son's wife, never lifts a finger around the house. She's always snarky and throws tantrums when things don't go her way. So her cleaning my room, that's suspicious to say the least. I don't know what you're up to, but it won't work. I muttered quietly, making sure Sherry, who was watching TV at high volume, couldn't hear me. Then I went back to my chores. I've put up with a lot from her, and my patience is wearing thin. I've warned her before, but if she continues to act this way, she'll have to face the consequences. My name is Lara, and I'm 73 years old. I met my husband Frank at a social event. We were both shy at first, but now we enjoy our evening coffee chats. After we got married, I became pregnant with our son George. Frank was thrilled and helped me with chores, even though he was clumsy. Once George moved out for work, our lively home became quiet, and we felt a bit lonely. Then George brought home Sherry, his then girlfriend. Frank and I thought she was beautiful and well-mannered. Sherry looked dazzling as she sat on the sofa with her long black hair tied up and her back straight. My husband and I talked a lot with Sherry, leaving George alone because he was too nervous to understand what he was saying. We liked her so much that we encouraged George to marry her quickly, which they did. Life got busy again, with their honeymoon and moving to a new place, but we enjoyed it. We were disappointed when they decided not to have children, but we understood. We thought peaceful days were ahead, but we were wrong. They kept coming back home for trivial reasons. Whether it was a broken air conditioner in the summer or unpaid electric bills in the winter, they'd stay with us but leave all the work to us. At first we felt sorry for them, but it became increasingly annoying. Frank, who once welcomed them warmly, now gets stressed just seeing them. As for George, he's as oblivious as ever, acting like he can do whatever he wants. My son and daughter-in-law decided to come visit us out of the blue. George called me last week and said, "Hey Mom, we're coming over next week, just a heads up." Then he went radio silent, leaving me in the dark about when exactly they'd arrive. Then, just as suddenly, I got a message from Sherry saying, "We'll be there soon, so get ready." I had to scramble to prepare everything. Frank said, "You handle the bedding and clothes. I'll go buy the groceries we're missing. If you could jot down a shopping list, that'd be neat. That'd be great." Then he went to change. I thanked him and quickly wrote down the ingredients for tonight's dinner, placing the note on the living room table. Then I started airing out the guest futon. When I returned to the living room, Frank was looking at the note. "Is this everything? If you remember anything else, just text me and I'll pick it up." He left with a smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. Just as I was about to get the clothes, I heard a loud voice from the entrance. "Lara, are you there?" Sherry was calling out to me from the front door without even ringing the doorbell. I rushed to open it. "Come on, you knew we were coming. Why didn't you leave the door open?" Sherry complained as she walked in. When she heard that, she instantly wrinkled her eyebrows and complained. "What's the matter? It's rude not to be happy when someone comes to visit," she retorted. I held my tongue and welcomed her in. "Where's George?" I asked, noticing his absence. "Oh, Frank snagged him for grocery shopping." I was a bit annoyed by her nonchalant attitude, but decided to let it go and continued with my preparations. Sherry didn't lift a finger to help. She just sat there, eating her own snacks and occasionally laughing at the TV. After a while, she suddenly stood up and left the living room. I assumed she went to the bathroom and didn't think much of it, but when she returned, she looked pleased. "Lara, your room was a mess, so I cleaned it up for you." I was taken aback. She had gone into my room without asking. I had questions, but decided to thank her anyway. She grinned and plopped back down on the sofa. Just then, Frank and George returned. I had asked Frank to buy quite a lot, knowing that the young couple would be staying for a few days. Frank had apparently enlisted George as his pack mule, and it looked like he had accomplished his mission. Frank handed me the groceries, stepping over a visibly exhausted George, who was still holding bags at the entrance. After saying thanks, I took out what I needed and started putting the rest away in the fridge.
"Hey, George, stop lounging and bring everything here."
Frank, who had just scolded George, still sitting by the entrance, pours himself some iced coffee and heads to the living room. George looked a bit annoyed, eventually brings in all the bags in a few trips.
"Man, I'm beat. Mom, pour me some iced coffee too." "Do it yourself."
Frank scolds George again for his whiny tone, but I prepare the coffee with a wry smile. "Welcome back. Thank you. Dinner will be ready soon, so just wait a bit."
All right.
George says as he takes the iced coffee and heads to the living room. He sits next to Sherry and gulps down his drink. I continued preparing dinner, but Sherry doesn't offer to help. Not that I expected her to. In fact, I'd rather she didn't. She might mess something up. Eventually, dinner is ready, and we all eat. It's a simple spaghetti meal, but no complaints from George or Sherry, so it's all good. After dinner, the room had that relaxed post-meal atmosphere. Frank and the young couple are watching TV. No conversation, but that's better than the alternative. I leave the living room to get their change of clothes. On my way, I run into Frank, who's just come out of the shower. Should I offer George the shower first?
I can go last.
"Oh, you've been out shopping. I can't make you wait." I enter the living room laughing, to find George dozing off. "George, don't sleep here. Go take a shower."
"Stop nagging."
George replies listlessly. I place his change of clothes on him and hand Sherry hers. Sherry takes the clothes, but quickly pushes them back with a frown. "I like the ones I wore before. They weren't this flimsy." I'm taken aback by Sherry's complaint, but arguing would only escalate things. "Oh, is that so? Wait a moment." As I go look for the other clothes, George, uninterested in the whole affair, yawns and heads to the shower. While searching, Frank pops his head in.
"Do you know where my golf balls are?"
"Aren't they next to the closet where you usually hang your coat and bag?"
"I can't find them."
Puzzled, I watch Frank leave and then go to Sherry with new clothes. "Ah, this is it. You get what you pay for." Yes, these clothes I bought when Sherry and I went shopping specifically for when they stay over. Sherry had insisted on something expensive, and I had given in. "I'll shower next. I don't want to go after an old person." Just as I'm about to retort, Frank returns, looking concerned. "Still can't find them?"
"Yeah. Sherry, do you know where the bag of golf balls next to the coat closet is?"
Frank, seemingly at a loss after searching everywhere, decided to ask around, not expecting much of an answer. What he got was a shock. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you accusing me of stealing? That's terrible. How could you suspect me?" Sherry's loud denial left me stunned. Frank tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but an irate Sherry wouldn't hear it. George, freshly showered, returned, and we all tried to calm her down, but she stormed off to the shower room still in a bad mood. The living room fell silent, filled with tension.
"What just happened?"
George asked Frank, noting that it's rare for Sherry to be this flustered. But why did she really get so angry? I couldn't help but suspect Sherry based on her usual behavior.
"Come on, Dad, apologize. You're practically accusing her."
Before I knew it, George and Frank were arguing. It took me quite a while to break it up. Just then, Sherry returned from her shower, making things even more complicated. Now Frank was the one being grilled by the young couple, but Frank didn't back down, especially when he scolded Sherry for her behavior today. She stormed off to the guest room. George continued to yell, blocking Frank, who tried to follow her.
You keep blaming Sherry, but you haven't apologized for suspecting her. You never apologize. That's what I hate about you.
Fed up, Frank muttered,
"Do as you please,"
and returned to his room. The living room fell silent again. I sighed and headed for the shower.
"I'm going to bed,"
George said curtly. Heading for the guest room, I stopped him. "The guest futon smells musty, George. Sleep in my room." Sherry when Frank and George went shopping, and Sherry overreacting to Frank's words. It just seemed suspicious to me, so I started to think that she was planning something by saying she had cleaned my room. So I decided to let George use my room, which was supposed to be for Sherry.
"Your room? I'm fine with a little mustiness. I'm not a kid anymore."
"What if you get pneumonia?"
"See, that's what I mean. Fine, I get it."
George seemed annoyed, but gave in and headed to my room. I glanced at the guest room Sherry was using. She wouldn't know about this exchange, being in a bad mood. If nothing's wrong, that's fine. I planned to prepare the guest room for George tomorrow. George opened the door to my room and went in.
"Whoa! What the?"
I heard George scream and rushed to my room, flinging open the half-closed door. I turned on the light and was speechless. George was in the room, clutching his leg in pain, surrounded by a scattering of golf balls. The golf balls Frank had been looking for were strewn all over my room. In a pitch-black room, George must have stepped on it. Of course he did. Who would ever think there'd be golf balls scattered all over the room? George lost his balance, stepping on one, tried to regain it, but ended up putting his weight in the wrong place and fell. It seemed like he hit the floor hard with his entire body. He's clutching his leg and whimpering, tears streaming down his face. Hearing the commotion, both Frank and Sherry came out of their rooms. Frank peered into the room from behind me and said,
"What's going on here?"
as he tried to help George up. But Frank also tripped on a golf ball and almost fell just like George. I turned around. There stood Sherry, pale as a ghost, trembling. Why is this happening? This is Lara's room." Her voice was so soft, it could have been drowned out by Frank's urgent questioning of George. "Yes, this is my room. Speaking of which, Sherry, you cleaned this room today, didn't you?" At my words, Frank and George turned around, and Sherry took a step back, flustered. "Did you see these golf balls when you cleaned?" I asked gently. Sherry just stood there, shaking. "Sherry, do you know anything about these golf balls?" Still Sherry remained silent.
"Hey, Sherry, what's going on? Answer me."
George, losing his patience, raised his voice. But he's clearly in pain from the fall. I didn't know you'd be coming into this room." Reluctantly, Sherry backed away, shaking her head. Frank muttered,
"We have no choice but to call an ambulance and the police."
At those words, Sherry collapsed on the spot, sobbing. I immediately called an ambulance and the police and checked on George. He was sitting, clutching his leg, struggling to breathe, his face red with anger. He answered my questions, but his eyes were filled with anger towards Sherry. Eventually the ambulance arrived, and I accompanied George to the hospital. After an examination, it was determined that George had fractured the top of his foot and would need to be hospitalized. By the time we got to the hospital, his foot was swollen and bruised, almost too painful to look at. The nurses and doctors advised reporting the incident to the police, clearly displeased with the situation. I said I would and stepped out to call Frank. Frank answered and told me the police had arrived and were currently taking statements. The call was handed over to the police officer, who said they would like to hear the full story later, to which I agreed. According to Frank, Sherry was just sitting on the floor, unresponsive to anyone or anything. After hanging up, I returned to George's hospital room, received instructions for his hospital stay, and decided to go home to gather some essentials. When I got back home, there was a crowd gathered around, making it difficult to get in. Finally, making it inside the house, Sherry immediately started to lash out. "Why wasn't it you? Why did George go into that room? If you had gone in, none of this would have happened to George." Breaking free from the police officer's restraint, Sherry lunged at me. "It should have been you. You're already old. If you had fallen, this house and this land would have been mine soon." Sherry, spewing hateful words with a ferocity that felt like she could bite me, was pulled away by Frank and the police. Still, she continued to hurl insults at me, struggling to break free and lunge at me again. And then Sherry was finally arrested. Suddenly, silent as if a switch had been flipped, she was escorted out of the house by the police. She was put into a police car and taken away, drawing the attention of many onlookers. Left behind, Frank and I stood there, stunned, watching the whole sequence of events unfold. Snapped back to reality by the police officer, I briefly answered their questions, and then headed back to the hospital with the essentials George needed. When I got to the hospital room, no nurses or doctors were around. After hearing about the situation at home, George, who had forgotten about his severe injuries, started making a commotion. A nurse rushed in, and we managed to calm him down.
"I've been suspicious of her for a while. The way she sometimes looks at Mom bothers me. I've been meaning to say something."
Despite what he said, I'd never sensed any such thing from George, nor did it seem like he'd noticed. Rather, he always seemed to avoid getting involved in troublesome matters. George has always been the type to say whatever sounds good to get through the moment. This time was probably no different. I was utterly exasperated.
"Hey, Mom, I've been thinking for a while now."
George, who had been ranting just moments ago, suddenly lowered his voice. Curiously, I asked what it was.
"I'm thinking of breaking up with Sherry."
I was surprised, but considering everything, it wasn't unreasonable. I don't know how Sherry acts when it's just her and George, but her behavior during visits has been terrible. She acts as if she's entitled to special treatment, refuses to help out, and throws tantrums if things don't go her way. We've never liked her, but we never thought about forcing George to divorce her. We've never been fans of her behavior, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean we ever thought about pushing George to divorce her. We never asked George what he thought about Sherry, and it felt wrong to even consider it. After all, George is an adult, and it's not our place to meddle in his marriage. Frank and I have even talked about staying out of it if George doesn't say anything. But now, George is coming to us for advice on divorce. I was at a loss for words.
"Mom, she's always been so harsh with you, and she's been rude to Dad too. I can't take it anymore."
That's when I felt something was off. Sure, Sherry has never held back her disdain for me. She doesn't even try to hide it, and I assume she acts the same way when it's just her and George. But she's indifferent to Frank. Frank is a gentle soul, but he's not much of a talker and has a stern face. That's probably why I've rarely seen them talk since they got married. So it felt odd when she got flustered after Frank asked about the golf ball incident. She usually just gives cold replies, but this time she raised her voice. She must have felt exposed by Frank.
"Do I have to pay alimony if we divorce? And there are hospital bills too. Can you help, Mom?"
That's when it clicked. George has been trying to butter me up for this very reason. It's heartbreaking, but George is my flesh and blood. I can read his expressions and gestures. I know what he's thinking. I've always found him adorable and couldn't help but meddle, but ever since he hit puberty, he's found it annoying. Like Sherry, George also resents us, but he's playing the good son for the sake of money. Hey, George, what happened to the money for the car you said you were going to replace? The other day when our son and his wife were visiting, my son said he was thinking about getting a new car and needed some financial help because it was a bit pricey. Obviously, if he mentioned this in front of Frank, he'd be met with opposition, so he discreetly came to me. I couldn't say no to my dear George, so I gave him the full amount. But the car he drove home in was the same one he had before. So you haven't bought it yet? If that's the case, you can use that money for the hospital bills. It might not cover alimony, but it'll help. But then what about the car? You can save up again once you're better. We have our own lives, you know. You're old enough to figure things out yourself. I'm pissed off. I was dumbfounded that George still expected financial help from us at this point. I left the hospital after saying just that. The truth is, I knew George had been squandering the money I gave him. Sherry had told me, though she was obviously benefiting from it too. I've always worried about him and meddled in his affairs, but it seems that has backfired. I took this as a good opportunity to tell Frank everything. After hearing me out, Frank said,
I've been meaning to talk to you about this.
He recently lost his job and is in considerable debt. I was shocked, and so was Frank, who had heard this while they were out shopping. At this point, there's nothing more to say to George. Frank and I decided to disown him. Some time has passed since then. Sherry is now in prison after being convicted in court, and it seems she divorced George before the trial began. But later I heard that it was Sherry who initiated the divorce. Apparently, they were both initially enjoying the money they'd gotten from me, but George started reducing Sherry's share until he stopped giving her any at all. That's why she did what she did in my room, thinking it would bring money her way. It's a terrifying thought. As for George, he seemed to cling to the idea of divorce once Sherry suggested it, and ultimately agreed. He's not burdened by much alimony, but he's drowning in the debt he created. Of course, the money for the car had long been gambled away. We covered his hospital bills, but he's working hard to pay off his other debts. It's a pathetic situation, but it's the result of his lifelong dependency. I hope he learns from this. As for Frank and me, the money we'd been giving George actually came from Frank. I didn't have that kind of money, but Frank loved George and wanted it to come from me. Now that's no longer an option. We're planning a hot spring trip we've never taken before. I do regret putting George through all this, but considering everything, it can't be helped. Now, the happiest moments are when Frank and I are looking at travel magazines.